The best place to start is in the third-person character blueprint. Here is the interact feature. When the player presses E, the interact event interface will be called. This will be used for many of the mechanics throughout the level. Another important place to start is with the chest. The chest interactive is the basic chest. There is an event dispatcher that all of the puzzles in the level call. The chest then binds to that event and rotates the lid. The rotate lid event has a start position and an end position. Only the x-axis moves. Then a sound is played. The timeline is then played, which lerps between the start position and the end position. Then the lid is rotated. At the end of this event, the collision is then set to not generate overlap events so that the text that appears above the chest is no longer visible once what is inside the chest has been collected. The first of the puzzle mechanics is the lantern mechanic. The player will approach the chest nearby and see that it says your environment is the key. This will cause the player to look around and see what's around them to interact with. The player will go up to the lantern and see that they are prompted to press E in order to light the lantern. Once the lantern is lit, the chest will open, revealing what's inside. In the second level of the lantern mechanic, the player will see that there are more lanterns. Once the player approaches the first lantern, they can light it just as they did the first one, and then eventually it will go out. The player must make all the lanterns lit so that the chest may open before the first one times out again. Once they're all lit, the player may collect the memory inside. The particle effect attached to the lantern, which I am calling fire here, has a set visibility that is triggered when the interact event is called. As well, there is a text render component that prompts the player to press E to interact with the fire, and when the collision for the lantern is overlaps, the text render will appear and then disappear when they leave that collision. Here is what the event interact looks like. We can see that the fire is then set to visible. Then the puzzle completed, the event that we saw in the chest interactive is called so that the chest opens. Then a counter within the third person blueprint adds to the puzzles completed. There is a delay of 5 seconds, and then the fire on the lantern will go out again. In the mastery version of the lantern puzzle, the lantern and chest interact differently. Whereas the lantern is associated with the chest in the first version of the puzzle, in the second half, the chest is associated with the 3 lanterns. So instead of having a chest, a variable within the lantern, in the lantern we now have an event dispatcher known as lantern interaction, which is called in here every time that the lantern is lit so that the chest knows when each lantern is lit. Now within that new chest for this lantern puzzle, we can see that the events are bound to the lantern interactions. We can see that there are 3 here as there are 3 lanterns. Then they are bound to an event called lantern interaction, which then calls the check lantern custom event, which I will show next. As well on the screen, we can see that the variables that will be seen in the next slide are called lantern fire visible. Those are all checked to be true, and then the puzzle is considered completed. Once that is called, we can see up at the top that that is again bound to the puzzle completed as well as the rotate lid. We can see here the 3 check lantern events that check each of the lanterns to see if the fire particle is visible, and then that sets the boolean known as lantern whichever number lantern fire visible that we saw in the previous slide. In the stone and pressure pad puzzle, the player will notice that there is a sand pile on the ground and a boulder. The player is able to push the boulder onto the sand pile. Once they do that, a sound will play, and then the chest will open. Player will be able to collect what's inside. In the second version of the stone puzzle, the player sees that there are 2 pressure pads, and they are not able to step on them themselves. Only the stones can roll onto the pressure pad. If you place the wrong stone on the wrong pressure pad, it will not make a noise, and the chest will not open. Once both of the stones are rolled onto their proper pressure pad, the chest will open. The pressure plate portion of this puzzle involves an event dispatcher called pressed. Now, when the proper stone is rolled on to the pressure pad and through the collision, a timeline is played. In that timeline, we can see that the event dispatcher is called. Then, and the event begin play, we can see that the puzzle solved, custom event is bound to that pressed dispatcher. If it is true, then it calls the puzzle completed event dispatcher from the chest interactive and then adds to the puzzle solved data collection. A new chest needed to be created for the second level of the stone puzzle due to there being 2 pressure plates and not wanting just one chest to call the puzzle solved. Event dispatcher needed to make a new chest. So here we can see that there is two pressed events that are assigned to each of the pressure plates. After both pressure plates have been set as true, then we have the puzzle completed event called, and the lid is rotated on that chest. For the stepstone puzzle, we have a tile on the ground. Once the player steps on the tile, the chest will open. In the second version of the stepstone puzzle, the player will approach the little frog. The frog will give them the clue that they need in order to complete the puzzle. And then once the correct code or sequence is pressed on, then the chest will open. The stepstones are created in the construction script. Therefore, when a sequence is entered, the appropriate number of steps will be generated. Here we can see that the correct sequence length is plugged into a for loop, which then is measured by the spacing component. The mesh component basically prints the stepstone. Then at the location of the static mesh component, a box collision is added. The code above that shows that it is getting the substrings, each of the letters and or numbers that I have entered for the code, and then making them into component tags for each of the steps. Then we go on to see that a point light is added. After the point light, we can see that it binds begin overlap to an event that we are about to look at. Here is the stepstone autogen function, which takes the component tags and then plugs it into this add code function that we will look at soon as that the third person character steps onto the stepstones. In the add code function, we can see that the input sequence, which is the sequence that the player is stepping on, is then compared to the correct sequence. And then if that is true, the puzzle will be considered solved. When a player approaches a statue, a text render will appear telling them to press E. When they do, sparkles will appear and chimes will play. When the player presses E, the interact interface that we saw in the third person character blueprint is called. This plays the chime noise, and then a timeline for the intensity of the point light on the statue is intensified, as well the visibility of the sparkle particle component is set as visible. When the timeline ends, the particle is then set to invisible, and then a blessing is added to the data collection. The player is able to collect yen and memories in the level. The collection is done by the player interacting with the component begin overlap for the coins and the orbs. For the yen, the coins are counted up by 1 for data collection, +1 yen is printed in the top left corner, and then the actor is destroyed. For the yen collectible, which is actually +10 yen instead of just +1, that is found in the chests that are introductory. The generate overlap event is hidden so that the player doesn't bump up against the chest and accidentally collect the coin without solving the puzzle first. Then when the chest is opened, generate overlap event becomes true. For the orb, it is the same thing.